Charleston County Sheriff Al Cannon joining us now live. Extensive background when it comes to counterterrorism. But these soft targets, these are the kinds of things that they're going after at this point.
Well, absolutely. And the attack in Mali points out something that I suspect many people are not aware of, and that is that ISIL has affiliates throughout northern Africa, Pakistan and Afghanistan as well, and they have attacked soft targets in those areas. And then there are competing factions of Al-Qaeda, which ISIL was spawned from, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, like in Africa that have attacked the Mall and
right.
Kenya and those sorts of things. So ISIL really has a lot of affiliates around the world that are doing and will do these kinds of attacks.
And Sheriff Cannon, you had a conference call with the Obama administration yesterday regarding the Syrian refugee crisis. Can you talk to us about what that conversation entailed?
Well, I was invited because of my participation in Major County Sheriffs to participate in this conference call. The White House Director of Public Engagement kind of led it, but there were representatives from the National Security Branch of the FBI, the Commissioner of Customs Border Protection, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, who's in charge of refugees and migration, and then Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. And they started the conference call explaining the process, the vetting process, and how many stages of interview there are initially with UN and then non-governmental organizations, and then those that make it through those filtering sessions are really interviewed in depth by the federal government agencies in the federal government.
How do you vet though
Well,
that's the thing, it's not like they have a social security number that you can go back and
well, and the other part is this, as I started, I just told you before, in 2009 there were two individuals in Bowling Green, Kentucky, who had come in as refugees from Iraq and slipped through, and point was made last night that changes have been made in the process since that, but they were caught and eventually pled guilty. They had actually fought in Iraq. Now, here's a significant difference between Iraq and Syria. In Iraq, we were there and engaged, and we interacted with a lot of people. We had sources of information and access to sources of information within Iraq. So our database, our cumulative knowledge about Iraqi refugees is far greater than our knowledge about and access to information concerning Syrian refugees. We've not been over there engaged in that kind of fashion. So, number one, we've not had the personal interaction with individuals to identify friend or foe and the history of having worked with them. But we also, I suspect, do not have agreements with and would not be able to trust information provided by the Assad government in Syria. We don't have agreements that give us access to databases over there that might be useful. Now, we have our own limited based on things that we've gathered, information, intelligence we've gathered about individuals, but that's going to be far less than we would have, say, on someone from Iraq.
So would you be for or against Syrian refugees coming to Charleston County?
Well, I'm opposed to that because I think, understand, you look at the most, the one that we can agree on, the institution that is most caring, the medical profession, and even they have a word that comes into play here, and that's triage. That's look at priorities and set priorities and take things into consideration when it comes recognizing that you can't help and administer or minister to the needs of everybody. Now, there are historic, and people are confused about the history of American immigration and the process there. there are statutory requirements of things that you must take into consideration in terms of bringing people into the country. And there are some alternatives to it. One part of the problem is this battle of attrition that we've in effect been fighting against ISIL is a long process, and it affords, as has been mentioned, concerns about Americans and Europeans, by the way, and the attacks last Friday are an example of the second part of that, and that is the foreign fighters that have gone to ISIL, have gone to Syria, have gone to Iraq, and have fought with ISIL that have come back. Those Europeans, by the way, hold passports from countries that allow them pretty much free access to the United States. Now, obviously, we're going to be looking at anybody in that regard, but it's a very complex and unsafe set of circumstances here, and it just is not wise with the limited knowledge and information we have about folks who'd be coming from Syria. However good the vetting is, it's based on primarily the interview process.
Well, what I think is even more terrifying is that report we had this morning that the number of people on the terror watch list who have legally walked in and bought guns. Let me absolutely comment on this fact. In Europe, where gun laws are very, very restrictive, people who have evil intentions will find weapons. They will find weapons. In fact, I guarantee you, with the mass onslaught of refugees coming from the Middle East, Syria in particular, they have actually been able to take advantage of the overwhelming numbers to bring in weapons, separate and apart from what might already be there. Break down these weapons into different parts. You take a part, you take a part. You know, and in the rush of the border in a lot of these countries, they've just lost control.
Sheriff Cannon, have you had an opportunity to talk to other sheriffs in the area? Do they share your position?
Well, I doubt, from all I've seen, I doubt there are very many. And by the way, there was a representative of a police agency in Maryland where they've agreed to accept Syrian refugees. I don't think that law enforcement is very happy about the state of affairs. They suggested that these NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that are actually accomplishing the settlement, notify local officials, but that's not true. We don't know when or who or where refugees are going to be brought. So that's one problem.
And the fear is that Trojan horse.
Well, and let me tell you one of the telling things to me, and this was a takeaway of great importance, and that is that they were not able to tell us. Now, they say they're going to get back with us on this, but they were not able to tell us what percentage of refugees that are put through this, quote, vetting process have been denied. Now, that's telling. That's something that they ought to be able to say. They're not able to say it, and these are the people who are key. Simon Henshaw from the Secretary of State, he is in charge of the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. So, I mean, you would think, particularly in the climate of people's concern today, that they would be able to say what kind of success rate they've had in terms of not letting people through this very narrowed process that we have now that relies almost exclusively on the interview process, because you don't have those data.
Sheriff Cannon, we could probably talk about this for hours, but unfortunately we're out of time. We appreciate you coming in.
Thank you so much, sir.
And this is certainly, we'll probably have to have you back to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sheriff.
Stay with us, coming right back. You're watching News 2 Today.